I just figured out that I'm providing a service, not a product. And I'm actually getting paid for providing services. You know what that makes me? Smart. Let's get to it. Welcome. Another fabulous episode of IBF On Demand. I'm your passionate, cheap, and not so humble host, Eric Wilson. You can find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. Thanks for the follows, the subscribes, the likes, the shares, everything that you guys do to kind of validate this program and why we're doing it. So thank you very much. I want to thank Arkiva as well for validating this program and being a sponsor, driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. Thank you, Arkiva. And once again, we have some events coming up. Chicago, I want to mention we have a boot camp in Chicago. Boot camp is coming up in just a few weeks, 15th and 17th of March. We're going to be in Chicago. And I believe that is like St. Patrick's Day. So be in St. Patrick's Day in Chicago. Right there is all you need. But we're also going to have an S&OP IBP boot camp as well. A great event. Check that out. We got other events as well. We've got lots of other events at ibf.org. Check out those events, everything you want to attend this year. And just the guests we have coming up, I actually met at one of these events last year. I think we actually met in the Chicago S&OP Best Practices Conference. She was actually a speaker in Orlando at the conference in Orlando in October. This year we're going to be in Scottsdale. She was part of an Unplugged series that you're going to be able to see. It's on the YouTube channel. We have an Unplugged series. Check those out as well. Some great content, talking with people from the conferences, after the conferences, of little nuggets they got out of it and as well. So check out the Unplugged series. She's actually on one of these Unplugged series, and she's going to be in the April conference, Predictive Analytics Conference in April in New Orleans. So she's actually going to be speaking this year in New Orleans. You can find her there. So we had a lot of great discussions with her in all these conferences she's been to. One of the things we talked about at the S&OP conference was S&OP in the service industry. Why it's unique. Why isn't anybody talking about this? And that was what I wanted to do this podcast on today, was S&OP in the service industry. And since we had some good conversation, I wanted to bring her on as well. There's not a lot on that topic. When you're talking about service industry and S&OP, there's not a lot on that topic. Yet we have a great article, Journal of Business Forecasting. I think it's the summer of 2015. Pat Bauer wrote a great article. He usually does, but this was one of his better articles on service industry, S&OP, and how you should do it. Or really, it was some great case studies that were involved in this. So check out that one as well. But even then, it doesn't get a lot of attention, and I'm confused why. Which is the reason why we should probably talk about it more, and the reason we're talking about it today. Rim is a Division Sales and Operations Planning Manager at Schlumberger, or SLB. She has extensive expertise in planning and supply chain, having worked in various roles in planning and supply chain across multiple segments and locations, including France, the UK, and currently the United States. She currently manages Schlumberger's Well Construction Division S&OP process at a global scope covering over $9 billion in revenue. She holds a degree in industry engineer from the National Polytech School in Algiers and a master's degree from Paris. Please help me welcome Rim. So welcome, Rim. I'm happy you could join me.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Happy to be there.
Yeah, I know we spent a lot of time last year in Chicago and Orlando, and this year in New Orleans. So we spent a lot of time together at conferences. So I'm glad we can bring you on the podcast and have a chance to talk here.
Cool. Thanks.
We had a great discussion. I think it was in Chicago. We had the discussion about service industry and S&OP, and you had some great insights. That's the reason I wanted to talk to you. But before then, I want people to kind of understand SLB, or formerly Schlumberger. What exactly is S&OP, SLB, and particularly in the service industry? I mean, I really don't think of them as a service industry. So how does it relate to a service industry?
So SLB is a technology company enabling innovation in the energy market. But what we do is in fact divided in I'm talking about the core. We divide that in three pillars. The first one is the reservoir performance, where we try to understand what's there. We try to understand the structure of the subsurface through some imaging capabilities. The second pillar is us drilling, basically, and working on constructing secure wells to be able to connect us on the surface to the energy reservoir. And the third pillar is production systems, and those guys are working on enabling the early production of the reservoir and maximizing its output. I'm really talking about the core. Obviously, we have another division, which is not divisions, another pillar of the business, which is new energy and digital. So really, if you want to think about how is SLB providing a service, I like the example that I heard, in fact, from my manager, comparing us to a hospital. If you think about me going as a patient to a hospital and trying to get an MRI, or let's be less dramatic, trying to get an echography, assuming I'm pregnant. So SLB is the hospital. So SLB is owning the technology or the machine, the asset that will enable the patient to have some understanding of what's going on in her tummy, if I'm talking about a pregnant woman. And what SLB does, the equivalent service that SLB provides, is really using the asset, the technology, to be able to provide some imaging capabilities of the subsurface to our customers. So that's just one example. So the customer will own the report, the imaging, and the SLB or the hospital will own the asset or the machine or the technology. So this is how we deliver service in our industry.
Okay, I mean that makes sense. I can see that as a service. It makes a lot more understanding now of how it's a service. So with that, I know you guys are very interested in creating an S&OP IBP type process. You're doing a lot of work in that front. With IBF help as far as developing S&OP processes there. What are some of the big challenges when talking about S&OP in a service type of company? What's some of the big challenges you have?
So I'm gonna step back just a little bit to make sure we are all clear on the definition of service. So what we do and what a service company does as a general rule is using resources to create value to a customer, right? So in the case of the hospital, I talked about the MRI or the ultrasound machine. In the case of SLB, we are talking of different portfolio of tools, of technologies that we use to deliver value added to the customer, whether it's understanding of the subsurface, whether it's drilling a well, etc. So the big challenge when it comes to S&OP, as you said, SLV is embracing this S&OP journey since a few years now. And the main challenge when it comes to S&OP for a service company, at least for SLB, is the fact that your sales language, I will try to oversimplify it. The sales language, basically the solution or the service that I sell to my customer, is not the same language as my resource language. In other terms, if I am, for example, a beverage company in a product sales business, I will forecast a demand for my drinks of this capacity, this number of cans, etc. And this corresponds directly, it's a linear correspondence to the resource I need to produce. While in SLB, I will sell to my customer, I don't know, this service. I have a few sections in my well, for example. So I will sell some direction inclination service for the first section, and then I will sell you a service of porosity and resistivity measurement, and then I will sell you another service. So that's cool. That's our sales and commercial people discussing with the customer. But then from the planning and supply chain side, we need to translate this in regards to what does that mean in terms of resources? What resources I'm talking about? How many of them? Etc. Etc. So that's the translation of the sales service to the resource service. It's really a translation. Imagine one is talking English, the other is talking French or Arabic, whatever. We need this translation.
Okay, so some of it's just changing the terminology you're using. So you still have the same principles, it sounds like, from an S&OP process. You're just changing some of the terminology to make it relatable for your business. You mentioned starting with sales, but then you went into the resource planning. And I think you had something, like a bill of resource or something that was unique, maybe to SLB or maybe unique to a service industry, that you really utilize then to help with that constraints planning. I mean, explain a little bit about resource planning, the bill of resource. Explain a little bit about that concept.
Yeah. So in fact, when we read the traditional books of S&OP or we Google the S&OP process, does not contain the resource planning as a standard step. That's one of the additions we add to our process in a service business to enable this translation from sales to resource hierarchy, right? We do have some part of our business which is purely product based, like drilling bits, and in that part of the business we don't have the resource planning as a meeting, right, in our S&OP process. So before even changing the terminology, this resource planning step is an additional one we introduce between the demand planning and the supply planning, just to make things talk to each others, right? So bill of resources is really that translator that will translate the language of my salespeople talking in English to make it more understandable to the resource people talking in Chinese. So the bill of resources is really that model that will link. When I say to my customer, I want a porosity, whatever, I want a resistivity service, I want a direction inclination service, this doesn't mean much in terms of tool. We need to create this translation. And this model, the BOR, is what will enable us to translate the demand, the sales demand to a gross resource demand. And then we go through the netting. And this is where the terminology is a little bit different. When we do a netting in a product business, I guess we are talking about metrics which are slightly different. We talk about efficiencies related to inventory, DSOH, GAMROI, those kind of things. While in a service business, we would more talk about asset utilization, we will talk about backup ratios, we will talk about all kinds of financial ratios to make sure that the efficiencies are taken into consideration as a fleet and not as a product, if it makes sense.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. So you're looking at business metrics that make sense to a service industry, and you're relating your resource planning, your sales, what the needs are. So you're taking the needs, you're taking the resource planning, and you're netting out to business metrics that make sense to the service. So that makes perfect sense, and I can see how that relates. So real quick, with that resource planning then, do you have like constraints does that help you? Because I know part of S&OP is managing or balancing supply and demand, but it's a lot more than that. You're balancing plans, but you're balancing constraints. Are you balancing constraints in a similar way then?
So we are still talking, we are still, the main constraints will come in the next step at the supply level, right? That's our main constraint. What we are trying to do in the resource planning phase is really to net our demand,
Okay.
is really to understand what kind of tools will be required to respond to my gross sale demand that was agreed on or presented in my demand review or my demand planning step in the S&OP. So we are not much constraining. What we are doing is that we are netting, taking into consideration a few parameters that will cut that demand, that gross demand. So if I consider that my asset utilization in this location should be above this amount of percentage, then my translation from gross demand to netted demand will take into consideration this requirement in asset utilization. If I consider that in this job I should not go beyond this amount of tool as backup, we call it backup ratios, then the allocation model will take into consideration all those parameters.
So once again, it's just some terminology difference. So with that, you mentioned some of the metrics, GMROR, some other metrics you're looking at. Are the metrics a lot different then of what you're focusing on as far as from a service perspective of, allocation of resources? Are the metrics a lot different?
So as I said, I think in principle, whether it's sales product business or whether it's a service business, the metrics are seeking the efficiency, right? So in the product business, it's more, at least in SLB, it's more an efficiency related to inventory, financial efficiencies, etc. In the service business, we are more trying to utilize the best possible our fleet, and we take into consideration some parameters that are not applicable in the product industry, like, for example, repairs. The spare part that we will need to repair our tools, those are part of the netted demand to make sure that to service my customer, I need to have this resource as a tool, but I also need to have the spare parts to cover this length of job, etc. So yes, I think it's more than terminology that differs. It's metrics themselves that differ, because the business model itself is completely different when you manage a fleet of tools that will perform a series of jobs serving different customers, and when you are just selling one product to one customer and just end of the story.
Okay, so since there is some uniqueness in it, but there's some similarities, I think
Yes.
people relate to examples. I mean, do you happen to have maybe an SLB example or something from your past? Can you translate what everything we said in maybe as an example that really make it real for people to understand?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to my initial example, thinking about a customer trying to connect to a reservoir containing oil, for example, or gas or whatever kind of energy. And so what we are selling to this customer is some information that will allow him to access this reservoir. And then some service allowing us as a service company to drill in the right way to connect to the reservoir. We need to think about this operation as a blind operation. We can go, 10,000 feet subsurface blindly. So we need to collect all kind of information on the path to understand whether we are going the right direction, whether we are getting close to the reservoir, whether we are not taking the right way. So there are different ways to capture this information. As I was mentioning, we can sell to the customer a solution of providing measurements related to the porosity, will give us, or the resistivity, or the gamma ray, which will altogether tell a story of how is the formation behaving and how close am I getting to my reservoir, etc. So this is how it happens from the demand planning side in SLB. And then for the translation to the resource, let's talk about resistivity, for example, we have a portfolio of tools that enable to measure this resistivity. So how are we gonna choose this tool versus that other tool to be able to respond to the customer need? And this is exactly the resource planning step that will suggest some tools, but here as well, and you will like this one, Eric, because I was reading your book on predictive analytics last few weeks, right? And we do use some predictive analytics, not in the purpose of forecasting, but in the purpose of translating, of building that BUR. So statistical modeling, artificial intelligence, all kind of things that try to understand the past historical data. How did that service connect with that tool? In what condition? In what geography? What was the weather? Were we in Alaska? So all kind of parameters that can enable us not just to copy paste the historical, but understanding the why of the historical demand to be able. You like it, huh? I told you.
I like it. Yes.
To be able to build that model that will enable us to target the right tools for the right services for the right geographies, etc.
Excellent. Well, I'm sorry you had to read my book, but yeah. I'm glad you got something out of it. And that kind of leads me to my final question. I think we have time for one more question, because a lot is not. We don't talk about a lot in the service industry for S&OP processes, and I think the S can stand for service then as well. And I know you're going to be talking in New Orleans. You're going to be speaking, and we're going to be talking more and more about service industries, and especially working with SLB, getting some case studies and things of that sort. My question is more for you guys starting this process. You said you've been working on it for a couple of years. One of the things I loved about you is you are sending people out to go, IBF conferences to say, hey, what are other companies doing? That's the reason you came to Chicago. It's the reason we had quite a contingency in Orlando. We had people from SLB come to Amsterdam. I mean, what are you doing to kind of see what other companies are doing? Are you seeing what S&OP looks like in literally product value, volume-based type companies and relating it? You're doing some studying on, some what other companies doing. Where are you getting your information for translating, hey, this is what we should be doing?
I know we all love to say that we are dealing with the most complex situations, but believe me, it's quite complex in SLB. And we have the two. We have the product-based business, which is quite similar to all what we can read in the books, the Tom Wallace and all those standard traditional theoretical books. But then for the service industry, I think we needed to adapt what we have been doing for a while, because let's not forget that we've been running business for decades, right? So we've been able to do it. And now we are trying to frame it in an S&OP word. For example, what I explained for this resource planning, taking into consideration the asset utilization to decide about the asset allocation model, etc. Those were things we used to do. It's just that we try to complement those things with some making sure that the basics of S&OP are fulfilled. For example, the consensus, making sure that it's not only planning and supply chain approving a resource plan, but it has to come as a consensus, multifunction, green lighting the plans and having financial involvement. So all the architecture of S&OP is what we are trying to build around our planning process, which has been there for a while. Yeah, we've been doing business for a while.
Oh, great. And hopefully you keep coming back at IBF conferences and we see you there, and you guys keep on picking things up there to be able to bring in and learn, adapt, and then share back. And that's one of the things I like about SLB as well, that you guys do that. So
Great, great. And we like as well. It's always, about those conferences, and I think I told you that at least 10 times, Eric. But in addition to the learning experience, I like the therapeutic aspect of it. Not feeling less lonely in the struggles we face in our own business. You go there and you talk to people and you find out that, oh my God, I'm not the only one working hard on my inventory. Oh my God, I'm not. So that's that's good for the morale as well. In addition
Yes.
to the adding value of learning.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you. I enjoyed this conversation we had together. It's great insight. So thank you for being part of this. And we'll see you in New Orleans in April.
New Orleans.
And I'm sure we're going to see more from you in articles and conferences in the future as well.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Thank you.
you.
See you there in New Orleans. Bye-bye.
All righty. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao. Bye.
That was a great interview, and I knew it would be. I think the problem is people look at S&OP, IBP as really just balancing supply and demand. I mean, they look at the process as really just an output or a transactional type of process to help them execute what they build or what they buy. I mean, I get it. S&OP really came out of a manufacturing world over 3 decades ago. But I also got news for you. What we're seeing today, what we're seeing companies do today, this is not your mama's S&OP anymore. This is really a business process to help enable coordinated decision making. That's what we're talking about. And it is adapted in the service industry. We're seeing more and more of that now. It's about balancing many competing objectives, many competing plans. I don't care which industry you're in, you have competing objectives. You have competing plans. S&OP helps you balance those plans. It's a business process to better enable and better planning strategic decisions so you can better execute services, including services. So it's really about being able to plan better so you can execute better. So my advice, here's my advice. Take it for that. It's my advice. Number one, if you're in a service industry, if you're in any industry, you want to start an S&OP, here's my advice. Don't get hung up on the names and terminology. I don't really care what we call it. I'm not hung up on acronyms. Inventory, okay. What's inventory in your world? Capacity, what's capacity in your world? S&OP, call it anything you want. What is the business process acronym label you want to put on it and you want to go with it? I'm not hung up on names. More importantly, what you do. So don't get hung up on the names and terminology. Focus on what you're trying to accomplish, what business problems you're solving. Number two, what plans need coordinated? What decisions need to be made inside your organizations? From a service, could be demand and service capabilities. It maybe not be supply and demand, it's your demand and your service capabilities. It could be something else that's unique to your industry as well. Number three, what do you need more visibility on? What do you need to see more to be able to execute better? Time horizons, decisions. Do you need to add people? Do you have to blank? Do you have a bench full of resources? How do you utilize this bench of resources better? Whatever your world may be as far as visibility, that's what you're looking to. What adds visibility so you can execute better? Number four, measure what is meaningful. Don't get hung up on what the typical S&OP KPIs are. They may not be typical in your world. There are some things you want to measure are business decisions, business strategies. Make sure your KPIs are meaningful. You measure it's meaningful to you. Time, cash flow. Connect to the business strategy, the health of the organization. And finally, number five, try it. I guarantee you're already doing something. You're already planning. You're already making decisions. Create structure. Create cadence. Enable those collaboration, consensus, and transparency in some of those processes you may already have. Well, that's a wrap. That does it for me in this podcast. I want to thank you very much for tuning in, listening, however you may get this. I hope I provided you another service, and I hope you are satisfied and a little happy. My name is Eric. You can find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. Thanks, Arkiva, for driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. Thank you, IBF, as well. Check out ibf.org. You're going to find under the events page a lot of events coming up. As I mentioned, you want more about S&OP? Check out the S&OP boot camp coming up March 15th through the 17th in Chicago. I said just happens to be St. Patrick's Day, so you can come up, join me, watch them dye the river green, have some great content, some great fun. We can spend that week together, March 15th to the 17th in Chicago at S&OP IBP Boot Camp. It's a great event. Hope to see you there. We also have the Predictive Analytics Conference coming up in April. Check out Liam. She's going to actually be there speaking at that conference. So you get to hear more from her. If you liked what you hear today, she has a great presentation planned for that conference in April in New Orleans. And remember, after you do any service, it's always best to wash your hands.